I want you to imagine a child, 8 years old, full of life, bright-eyed and curious, one who should have been in school, learning, playing with friends, and surrounded by the warmth of a family. This child is Relisha Rudd, a young girl from Washington, D.C. whose name, once full of promise, would soon be entangled in one of the most haunting disappearances in recent history. Relisha's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a chilling mystery, one that remains unsolved to this day. A disappearance that took place against the backdrop of a homeless shelter, a place where she, along with her mother and 3 younger brothers, lived in uncertain conditions. But this story isn't just about the loss of a child. It's about the unraveling of trust, the manipulation of those who should have protected her, and a case that slipped through the cracks of public attention until it couldn't anymore. In this video, we'll walk through the timeline of Relisha Rudd's disappearance, piece together the events surrounding her last known moments, and ask the hard questions that still remain unanswered. From her mother's involvement to the shadowy figure who gained her trust, we will examine the details of a case that has left an entire community heartbroken and frustrated. And we will not just look at what happened to Relisha, but at the world that failed to protect her. Why did no one step in when the warning signs were so clear? How did a man with a criminal history manage to get so close to an innocent child? And most importantly, what happened to Relisha Rudd? These are the questions that have haunted many, and the answers? Well, they remain elusive. As we dive into this story, I want you to keep one thing in mind. There are countless missing children across the world. But there's something about Relisha's case that has stirred something deeper in the hearts of those who followed it. Was it the vulnerability of a child living in a shelter, or the shocking chain of events that followed her disappearance? I don't know, but I do know this. Something doesn't add up. And that's why her story deserves to be told. Stay with me as we journey through the facts, the confusion, and the devastating reality of Relisha Rudd's disappearance. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must first take a look at the environment that shaped Relisha's early life. The D.C. General Shelter, a place that would come to symbolize so much more than just a roof over her head. The shelter was far from a home. Located in the heart of Washington, D.C., it was a converted hospital, transformed into a haven for the city's most vulnerable families. But it wasn't the kind of place a child should grow up in. It was overcrowded, noisy, and often filled with a sense of uncertainty. Families, many struggling to find stable housing, were housed in what was meant to be temporary accommodation. But for some, the shelter became home for much longer than anyone could have imagined. Relisha Rudd's family, her mother, Shamika Young, and her 3 younger brothers, were among the many who called the shelter their home. A place where hope and despair often intertwined. Shamika did the best she could to care for her children in a challenging situation, but the weight of raising 4 kids in a shelter was not something any parent could carry without strain. The D.C. General Shelter had its own set of challenges, unpredictable living conditions, an overwhelming sense of instability, and very few resources to support the families trying to rebuild their lives. For a child, the shelter was a constant reminder of the harsh realities of life. The loud noises, the transient nature of those living there, and the overwhelming sense of impermanence. Yet, even in such a place, Relisha tried to make the best of her circumstances. From those who knew her, it's clear that Relisha was a bright, energetic child who was full of promise. She had a love for school that seemed to defy the chaos around her. Her teachers at Payne Elementary School described her as an intelligent and enthusiastic student, someone who loved to learn and was eager to please. Her schoolwork was important to her, and she was well liked by her classmates. Relisha had the kind of personality that drew people to her. She was friendly, playful, and full of life. But it wasn't just her academic interests that stood out. Those close to Relisha, including her family and the few who took the time to get to know her, knew her to be a child who loved to spend time with her family, especially her younger brothers. Despite the challenges of their living situation, She was a caring big sister. She was protective, and the bond between her and her siblings was a bright spot in the midst of an otherwise difficult existence. Relish's personality shone through even in such a trying environment. She was resilient. It's not easy to grow up in a shelter, but Relisha had learned to make the best of things. Her mother, Shamika, often spoke of her warmth and compassion, and how she would try to keep things light for her younger brothers, always making sure they were happy, even if that meant she had to push aside her own worries. However, life at the shelter wasn't all easy for Relisha. The constant change of faces, the lack of privacy, and the overwhelming sense of uncertainty weighed heavily on her. And yet, she remained determined to make the most of the life she had. Her love for school was evident, and it's clear that she still dreamed of a brighter future. There was something in Relisha that made her stand out from the others. A quiet ambition, a determination to escape the limitations placed upon her by her circumstances. She had dreams, hopes, and an undeniable spark that made her unforgettable to those who had the privilege of crossing paths with her. But the harsh realities of life in the shelter would soon be overshadowed by something far darker. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Relisha's world would shift in ways that would forever change her fate. How? That's where the story begins to take an unsettling turn. How could a young girl, full of promise and potential, fall into the hands of a man who would ultimately cause her unimaginable harm? Relisha's story, like so many others, was a story of survival. But survival in this world sometimes means you're forced to trust the wrong people. In her case, it would mean trusting someone who was far more dangerous than she could ever have known. And it was that trust that would set the stage for what happened next. The story of Relisha Rudd's disappearance took an unexpected and dark turn with the introduction of Khalil Malik Tatum, a name that would soon be tied to her tragic fate. To understand how this man, a janitor at the D.C. General Shelter, became so deeply involved in Relisha's life, we need to take a closer look at who he was and the troubling history he carried with him. Khalil Malik Tatum wasn't a stranger to the law. His criminal record included a history of violent offenses, though his past seemed to be largely overlooked as he moved into his role at the shelter. In his 50s at the time, Tatum's past was riddled with red flags. Yet these were all ignored or downplayed as he blended into the environment of the shelter. He had a history that included arrests and convictions for crimes that were violent in nature. Yet despite his criminal history, he managed to secure a position as a janitor at the D.C. General Shelter, a role that would allow him to move about the building with ease and access vulnerable families. His presence was initially dismissed as just another worker performing a routine job. But in reality, Tatum was far more manipulative and dangerous than anyone could have suspected. Tatum's position at the shelter gave him a unique opportunity to ingratiate himself with the residents, especially with families who were already struggling. In such an environment, where people were living in temporary and uncertain circumstances, Tatum's seemingly kind gestures could easily be seen as acts of goodwill. For Shamika Young, Relisha's mother, it wasn't long before she began to trust Tatum. He became a familiar face in their lives, someone who appeared to be kind-hearted and generous. Over time, Tatum began offering gifts to the family, things that might have seemed harmless at first, but in hindsight should have been seen as attempts to build trust and manipulate them into depending on him. He began spending more and more time with Shamika and her children, gradually inserting himself into their lives under the guise of helping out. One of the most significant moments in this troubling narrative was the way Tatum built his relationship with Relisha. He didn't just become a figure in the background of her life. He became a close confidant. Tatum took on the role of a father figure to Relisha, and before long, she was calling him her goddaddy. In her innocent mind, he was someone she trusted, someone who was there for her when no one else could be. But this bond that was forged between them, one of trust and dependence, was built on manipulation. Tatum was able to groom Relisha, drawing her into his orbit and isolating her from those who might have been able to intervene. over time, he became a fixture in her life, a constant presence who was able to control how she spent her time and who she interacted with. Shamika, for her part, seemed to trust Tatum as well. He wasn't just a figure who helped with the family. He was a person who appeared to care for them. Shamika allowed him to take Relisha out of the shelter, under the pretense that she was going to stay with Tatum and his grandmother. It was a decision that, in hindsight, was dangerously naive. But for Shamika, living in a shelter with her children, it may have seemed like a small break, something that might help Relisha experience a different kind of life, if only for a short while. She believed Tatum's promises, the gifts he gave, and the reassurance that everything would be fine. And so, without raising many questions, Shamika let Relisha go with him, assuming that the relationship Tatum had established with the family was genuine. But there were red flags, small warnings that were easily ignored or misunderstood. Tatum's past was full of violent crimes, but no one seemed to pay attention to that when he took on his janitor job. It's clear now that those who were responsible for overseeing the shelter's residents and workers should have been more vigilant. Tatum's ability to move about the shelter unchallenged allowed him to slowly infiltrate the lives of those living there. His ability to gain the trust of Shamika and Relisha, and the lack of oversight from shelter management, created the perfect storm for tragedy. There were also signs that something wasn't right. Relisha's absences from school, though they were initially excused by her mother, should have raised alarms. The social worker who visited the shelter and tried to make contact with Relisha and Tatum should have been able to sense that something was amiss when Tatum failed to show up for a meeting. But by then it was too late. The trust had already been established, and Tatum had already begun to pull Relisha into his web. In the coming months, as we'll see, these red flags would begin to take on new significance. The lack of attention to Tatum's behavior, his growing influence over Relisha, the suspicious nature of her absence from school, and his increasingly isolated movements would all point to something deeply disturbing. But it wasn't until Relisha went missing, and the events surrounding her disappearance unfolded, that the full extent of Tatum's manipulation would become clear. The story of Relisha Rudd's disappearance is one marked by unsettling silence, gaps in time, and a mounting sense of dread. As we piece together the timeline leading up to her vanishing, the picture of a young girl slowly disappearing from the lives of those around her, especially her family, becomes clearer. Yet, no one could have imagined the disturbing truth that would emerge from what seemed like innocent circumstances. Relisha's absence from school began in late February 2014. At first, it seemed like just another temporary disruption. Children sometimes miss school for all sorts of reasons: illness, family issues, or even a short break. But as the days turned into weeks, it became evident that something far more serious was happening. By March, Relisha had missed more than 30 days of school. Her mother, Shamika Young, made the decision to excuse the absences, explaining that Relisha was under the care of someone she trusted, Khalil Tatum, the man she had come to see as a protector and father figure to her daughter. Shamika told school officials that Relisha was staying with Dr. Tatum, as if that was enough to explain her absence. She didn't think to question where her daughter was or what exactly was going on. After all, Tatum had ingratiated himself so completely into their lives that Shamika believed he had nothing but good intentions. Relisha, too, seemed to trust him without hesitation. But as the days turned into weeks, the situation became harder to ignore. It wasn't long before the school began raising concerns about Relisha's extended absence. When more than 30 days had passed without the required explanation, the school's social worker took action. She reached out to Tatum to arrange a meeting in early March, attempting to get to the bottom of what was happening with Relisha. However, Tatum, ever the manipulator, failed to show up for the meeting, leaving the social worker with more questions than answers. Alarm bells should have gone off at that point, but instead, the system appeared to stall. The social worker's attempt to track down Tatum and resolve the situation was the tipping point. It was no longer something that could be dismissed with excuses. It was only then that the authorities were notified that Relisha Rudd was missing. Yet, before the authorities could fully grasp the situation, pieces of the puzzle were already starting to fall into place. Surveillance footage, a crucial piece of evidence, began to paint a chilling picture. On February 26, 2014, a camera caught Relisha walking alongside Tatum at a Holiday Inn Express in Northeast Washington, D.C. They appeared to be arriving together, seemingly innocuous at the time. However, what was more troubling was what happened next. On March 1, 2014, Relisha was once again captured on camera, this time walking with Tatum into a room at the Days Inn on New York Avenue, also in D.C. The footage from that day was the last confirmed sighting of Relisha. From that moment forward, there was no sign of her. No one knew where she went or what happened to her after that. She had simply vanished. The authorities would soon piece together the reality of what had occurred. But at the time, no one could explain where Relisha had gone, or why no one had seen her since that day at the Days Inn. Her mother, Shamika, would later claim that she didn't know where Relisha was, but she also didn't raise immediate alarms. It seemed like no one was prepared for the events that had unfolded so suddenly. The security footage provided the only tangible evidence of Relisha's final moments before her disappearance, yet it raised even more questions. Why had she been with Tatum at a hotel? Why was no one able to account for her movements after that day? The unsettling nature of these questions would grow as the investigation continued, and as Tatum's involvement in the case became clearer. But for now, all anyone knew was that a young girl had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, broken trust, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Relisha was gone, and the search to find her would soon reveal things no one could have anticipated. Once Relisha's prolonged absence from school and Tatum's failure to meet with a social worker on March 19, 2014, raised alarms, the authorities were immediately alerted, marking the official start of the investigation into her disappearance. The severity of the situation quickly became evident. Relisha, an 8-year-old girl, had vanished, and her last known interactions were with a man who had gained her trust in unsettling ways. The investigation began in earnest, but it was complicated by the lack of immediate leads. While surveillance footage from the hotels provided some answers, it was limited in scope. The footage only confirmed what authorities already suspected, that Relisha had been with Tatum. But beyond that, there was little else to go on. The public and media quickly became involved, amplifying the search efforts, with local news outlets broadcasting appeals for information and offering rewards for any tips that could lead to Relisha's whereabouts. Despite the widespread media attention, however, the investigation faced significant obstacles. The search was hampered by a lack of concrete evidence. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who could provide additional information, and no trace of Relisha's whereabouts after March 1, 2014. Authorities combed through the hotels where Relisha had been seen, interviewed relatives, and followed any potential leads, but the path forward remained unclear. With every passing day, the uncertainty deepened. It became increasingly clear that Relisha's case was far from ordinary. There were no clear answers, and the investigation appeared to be reaching a dead end. The more the authorities searched, the more they realized that they were up against a puzzle with too many missing pieces. As the search for Relisha Rudd continued, a chilling discovery would send shockwaves through the investigation. On March 20, 2014, just days after Relisha was last seen, Khalil Tatum's wife, Andrea Tatum, was found shot in the head inside a motel room in Prince George's County, Maryland. The discovery was grim and mysterious, as surveillance footage from the previous night showed Khalil and Andrea entering the hotel room together. There was no sign of a struggle, but the circumstances surrounding Andrea's death immediately raised suspicions. Tatum, who had been at the center of Relisha's disappearance, became the prime suspect in his wife's murder. The timeline of events seemed more than coincidental. Relisha's disappearance and the murder of Andrea Tatum were now linked by Tatum himself. The authorities quickly issued an arrest warrant for Khalil Tatum, but he had already disappeared. A manhunt ensued, with law enforcement searching relentlessly for him, hoping to uncover more about the mysterious connection between him and the two tragedies. But on March 31, 2014, the investigation took yet another unexpected turn. Khalil Tatum's body was found in a shed at Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens in Washington, D.C. He had taken his own life, and the gun used in his suicide was the same weapon that had killed his wife, Andrea. The discovery left more questions than answers. Was Tatum the sole perpetrator behind the disappearance of Relisha, or had he been involved in something far more complex? The theory that Tatum may have killed himself after committing the murder of his wife and possibly Relisha hung heavily in the air. Authorities were left grappling with the fact that the answers they sought were now locked in the mind of a man who had taken his own life, leaving behind no clear explanation. Despite the link between Tatum's death and his wife's murder, the fate of Relisha remained a haunting mystery with no resolution in sight. As the investigation continued, two main theories emerged about what happened to Relisha Rudd, but neither could provide a definitive answer. The first theory, which dominated much of the early investigation, was the possibility that Khalil Tatum had murdered Relisha. The timeline surrounding her disappearance, his connection to her, and the tragic death of his wife painted a grim picture. Some believed that Tatum, in a moment of violence, could have killed Relisha. However, no body was found, and no concrete evidence tied him directly to her death. Despite the suspicion surrounding him, authorities were unable to definitively conclude that he had taken her life. The second, more disturbing theory was that Relisha might have been sold into sex trafficking. The idea that Tatum, with his criminal history and manipulative nature, could have been involved in trafficking young girls gained traction in the media and public discussions. It seemed plausible to some that Tatum could have taken Relisha and sold her to traffickers. However, after extensive investigation, the D.C. Metropolitan Police ruled out this theory. There were no indications of trafficking, and no leads or evidence surfaced to support the claim. The lack of physical evidence, like witness statements or a direct connection to trafficking rings, ultimately led the police to dismiss this possibility. In the absence of conclusive evidence, the theories about Relisha's fate remain unanswered. Was she the victim of a violent act by Tatum, or did she disappear into a world of trafficking that no one could trace? Theories abound, but the truth remains elusive. Relisha's disappearance continues to haunt both her family and the authorities, and the case remains unsolved, leaving the world to wonder what truly happened to an 8-year-old girl who trusted the wrong person. Relisha Rudd's case initially garnered significant media attention, as the mysterious disappearance of an 8-year-old girl from a homeless shelter shocked the public. News outlets across the country reported on her vanishing, and there were public appeals for information. However, as time went on, the case began to fade from the headlines. It was overshadowed by other high-profile missing persons cases, particularly those involving white women, which often received more sustained coverage and focus. This disparity in media attention brings us to the concept of missing white woman syndrome. This term, coined by the late journalist Gwen Ifill, refers to the media phenomenon where missing persons cases involving white women tend to receive far more media coverage than cases involving women of color, particularly black women. The intense focus on cases like those of Elizabeth Smart or Laci Peterson, both white women, contrasts sharply with the relative silence surrounding missing women of color like Relisha Rudd. In Relisha's case, while there was some coverage, the sustained attention that typically accompanies such high-profile cases was lacking. This imbalance has sparked conversations about racial bias in media reporting. Relisha, a black girl, vanished without a trace, and her story, though tragic and compelling, was often sidelined. Now, I want to hear from you, the viewers. Do you think missing white woman syndrome still influences media coverage today? Has the media landscape changed, or does racial bias still play a significant role in how missing persons cases are covered? Share your thoughts in the comments. As of 2025, the investigation into Relisha Rudd's disappearance remains open, but there have been no significant breakthroughs in the case. Despite years of searching, Relisha's whereabouts remain unknown, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance continue to puzzle investigators. The case, which once held the nation's attention, has faded from the public eye, but the search for answers continues in the background. The investigation into her disappearance has faced numerous challenges: lack of physical evidence, a dearth of new leads, and the unresolved questions surrounding Khalil Tatum's role in the case. However, law enforcement has not given up on finding answers, and there remains hope that new information could emerge, even after so many years. The possibility of new leads or breakthroughs still exists, with the potential for closure for Relisha's family and the public. For now, the case of Relisha Rudd stands as a painful reminder of the fragility of justice and the importance of keeping missing persons cases alive in the public consciousness. I urge you, the viewers, to continue sharing Relisha's story, to help keep her case on the radar and support the ongoing efforts to uncover the truth. Every tip, every piece of information, no matter how small, could be the one that leads to answers. Let's not let Relisha's case fade into obscurity. As we wrap up the story of Relisha Rudd, I want to take a moment to hear from you, the viewers. This case, like so many others, raises important questions. Do you think there was more that could have been done to protect Relisha? What are your thoughts on the sex trafficking theory? Do you think it's a possibility, or does the evidence suggest otherwise? What do you think is the biggest factor in cases like this getting overlooked in the media? Your opinions matter, and I encourage you to share them in the comments section below. This discussion is vital for raising awareness and keeping cases like Relisha's at the forefront of our minds. As we close, let's remember that justice for Relisha Rudd has not been achieved, and we must continue to stand for the truth. Her story isn't over yet, and with the collective effort of everyone who continues to speak her name, we can help bring the truth to light. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. By doing so, you are contributing to keeping cases like this in the public eye, ensuring that the fight for justice never fades away. Thank you for watching, and let's all continue to spread awareness, because we can make a difference.